It's a real pleasure to introduce Ruth and to hear her keynote talk today. Ruth is a professor of 19th century literature and thought and head of the Department of English at Royal Holloway. Like all our other keynotes, Ruth brings an expertise in infrastructure and its role in creating or breaking communities. In particular, her monograph, Writing the Stagecoach Nation, Locality on the Move in 19th Century British Literature, published by Oxford University Press in 2016, examines how historical fiction of the Victorian recent past uses the stagecoach as an analogy to move from a sense of local belonging towards an evocation of the wider but abstract community of the nation. Her recent projects also examine intersections between rootedness in a particular place and mobility. She's principal investigator for the AHRC project Provincialism, Literature and the Cultural Politics of Middleness in Britain 1800 to 1900, and Finding Middlemarch in Coventry 2021, which explores the lives of George Eliot's novel during Coventry's year as the city of culture. Her other research achievements include the books Socialism, Sex and the Culture of Aestheticism from 2007, and The American Experiment and the Idea of Democracy in British Culture 1776 to 1914 from 2013, and her editorship of the Journal of Victorian Culture from 2008 to 2015. She's also a core panel member of the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship Scheme and chair of the advisory board of the UKRI Future Leaders Fellows Development Network. So, as I'm sure you'll agree, our final keynote really is an essential voice in the conversations that we've been having over the last couple of days, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Ruth to our digital platform.
Thank you so much. That was so characteristically generous, Jo, as an introduction. And I'm in everyone's debt here today because I've learned so much, and it's just great to hear a new generation of scholars, so international as well, coming to the fore here. And I'm just going to start sharing my screen. But just to say as well, as a head of department, it's been like a wonderful holiday for me preparing this talk. So I hope it makes sense. I feel quite far from my identity as a researcher at the moment, but let's hope it's still there somehow. Okay. So let's just, there we go. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. So in July 1854, a civil servant was called to give 5 days of evidence to a select committee on the improvement of postal services in Ireland. The members of the select committee, which included the Westminster MPs representing the Irish constituencies most concerned, subjected the surveyor of post to rigorous questioning about the performance of the postal network in Waterford, Tipperary, Cork and Limerick. The civil servant was well briefed and well chosen as an expert witness. Anthony Trollope Esquire had at that stage worked in the post office for over 20 years. And rather like his recurring character, the unheroic civil servant Johnny Eames, he'd grown from slapdash, indebted, callow youth to one who enjoyed the skillful baffling of politicians and his seniors. Thanks to a series of changes in his roles and responsibilities in over a decade spent as a surveyor of post in Ireland, Trollope felt he could claim, "I have local knowledge over the whole of Ireland." And this is how he starts his evidence, as you can see in this snippet here. In what follows today, I'm going to explore the tensions that underlie this claim to have local knowledge at such a scale through the imperial infrastructures of the British Post Office. In addition to mapping out some of the questions of scale, place and locality in Trollope's evidence through a short diversion on a railway junction in Tipperary I've become a bit obsessed with, I apologise, I want to end by considering Trollope's innovations in the forms of the novel that took shape just as he was giving his evidence. Despite publishing 2 novels set in Ireland written during his years there, it was with The Warden in 1855 and Barchester Towers in 1857 that Trollope's literary success took shape. It was the provincial novel and the provincial serial novel that made him. And although the Barchester sequence, unlike the later Palliser novels, took the infrastructures of the Church of England rather than the civil service and politics as its focus, these are, I suggest, supremely modern in their attempt to negotiate living within the infrastructure state. The Barchester novels examine the rise of a centralised, networked secular state and simulate the breaking and remaking of the everyday unthought practices that had previously sustained the temporal infrastructures of the established Church of England. The national church is in the Barchester serials provincialised, made parochial, reflecting the massive shifts in centralizations that resulted in the ecclesiastical commissions of 1836 and 1814. I won't go into that to detail today, but we see foreshadowed in Barchester is that possibility of the civic role of the church as a kind of ethical or civic infrastructure, and we maybe get to talking about that more in our discussion. So what is it about the infrastructure state and the post office? And this particular inquiry. So the 1854 inquiry was instigated to see whether a further extension to the carriage of mail in Ireland by the rail network would benefit the commerce and society, and though it's never expressed as such, the rule of centralised government in London over Ireland. This is the occasion of this inquiry that Trollope was giving evidence at. The post office, after all, was the infrastructure at the heart of the modern state that made rule at a distance possible. And Patrick Joyce, in his States of Freedom, really makes so clear that there was such a strategic priority around the speed and security of post in Ireland after 1800, which was about a design to secure the realm. This is not about postal communities and citizenship in the way that we might frame those debates in England, but it's clearly about a kind of national security issue of the realm. And here there's in thinking about the British Post Office and the infrastructure state, Joyce writes, I think, really compellingly here, the idea and in considerable measure the material achievement of the British Post Office was that it would create subjects capable of relating to others they'd never met, so engaging in action at a distance with others, actions both economic and social. It also refashioned the ties of friends as well as of strangers. Thus, the liberal state necessitated the cultivation of subjects able to work by the rules of the postal game. And it's that subject formation that, for me, makes the link between what Trollope's doing as a civil servant within these post office infrastructures and his later work within the forms of the novel of the Barchester sequence. So I know some people here are playing infrastructure scholar bingo, and I'm just going to give us some bullet points here that'll take us through that. So what does the post office achieve? A flattening of space and time, ding, for bureaucratic ease with things like the uniform penny post. The post office, of course, is the instrument for government at a distance, whether that's the rural English province, Ireland, India, though there's a different responsibility for post in India. It's also, as Joyce points out, I think really compellingly, a way in which the idea of monarchical proclamations, the presence of the monarch and rule, is communicated, no longer a series of proclamations nailed up or read in sermons through the established church. After the middle of the 19th century, that material presence of the monarch really is transformed into the image of a head on a stamp. And I love that idea of a different way of extending monarchical presence with the secular centralized state. And of course, the technologies of the post office, whether that's the mapping of the roads, the mail coach system, all the contracts of road improvement. And we had those wonderful examples from Claire yesterday on the London to Holyhead Dublin post route, is about the transfer of local knowledge to a distant centre. So knowing your local roads on foot, but the knowledge and mapping and surveying then transferring to a centralised directive with the various movements throughout the 19th century in terms of road infrastructures. So if we understand the broader function of the post office infrastructure at this macro level, as scholars, a system that fulfilled the endless needs of the state to find ways to communicate and rule, the business of the select committee that Trollope was giving evidence through was much more focused on the experience and functioning of infrastructure at the micro level, at the local level. An extraordinary amount of questioning of Trollope, and I did get a bit obsessed with this myself, and some of the funniest interchanges in these 5 days of evidence returned again and again to an alleged incident, or maybe two incidents, no one was quite sure, in which the horse-drawn mail car collecting post from the Dublin to Cork rail line at Gould's Cross in Tipperary had lost its bags, its driver, or both possibly, on a journey to Cashel and Clonmel. And Trollope seems to have rather delighted in infuriating the Tipperary MP, Francis Scully, who's asking the questions in these extracts here, who of course was MP for Trollope's own former town of residence, Clonmel, at that time. And you can sort of see in these things, and of course I'm hovering over my own text here. So, but you can see evidence, in the question from Mr. De Vere 2485. Do you now admit that you were mistaken in asserting that the man fell off the car because he was drunk? And Trollope, you know, this civil servant with responsibility for a huge district in Ireland, says, I do not know if the man was drunk. It was probable he was drunk. When I heard he fell off, I assumed he had been drunk. And there are pages as to in this debate as to whether this loss of mailbags was down to a single man being drunk or not. So the whole business of the commission, you know, comes to hang on these couple of events in a railway junction in Ireland in October 1852. And there's another feature of this questioning of Trollope that really brings home a kind of truism that I think we know about the infrastructural transitions of the 19th century. Here, the fact that the inquiries partly instigated by the fact that certain places in Ireland have been disadvantaged by the introduction of the transport of mail by rail. That as the post travels fast on the fast line from Dublin to Cork, other inland towns such as Clonmel in particular have suffered because the cost of sending the mail by train has been offset by using a single horse mail car to make the connecting routes up to non-network towns. So a new network has pushed old, towns off the older networks as a result. So some things have got slower. So there's some truisms here again about the history of technology and infrastructure. The introduction of the new often slows down existing communication and circulation. And as Paul N. Edwards points out in his seminal piece on infrastructure and modernity from 2003, we notice infrastructure when its flow is disrupted or when it stops working, in this case here. Infrastructural change, as it was laid bare in this commission, discloses the workings of uneven development. It lays bare the tensions between metropolis and periphery, province and colony. And perhaps going back to what Claire was pointing out yesterday, it makes us see it as infrastructure with vested interests of power and the state, as opposed to a network that flattens out those disparities. But also the issue of Clonmel and Cashel and the fact that it gets less post now in the railway era makes clear that infrastructure can make an unmake place. It has a huge role in laying out the destiny of particular locales. Existing flows of capital and information that make the fortunes of towns can be erased, as in the demise of former stagecoaching centres, which of course Clonmel itself was one of as well, and tiny places become increasingly important on the network. So part one then is a diversion by a Gould's cross, networking local and parochial interests in a globalizing imperial system. And I do apologize, as Nicola knows, they're relaying the roads on campus. I've now got something digging up the road outside my window, so I hope that's not going to travel through to the sound you've got here. Okay, so what we have here then is that sense that infrastructure, when it works, erases particularities of place, but it also creates nodes on its network. I'm going to suggest these nodes are places that are remade or made by their function on a network and as a junction or bridging point. But they are also points of vulnerability where a shift in scale occurs or a transition between different sorts of infrastructure. And this is where, in a sense, imperial flows encounter bumps on the road. So Trollope, I'm suggesting through his civil service role, had an eminently clear understanding that local political and economic interests shape and colour an imperial network and are part of the friction around that flow. For example, he knew the great Irish stagecoach contractor Bianconi quite well, and it was Bianconi's who held the contract for the mail car from Gould's Cross to Cashel that became such a subject of discussion at the inquiry. Bianconi, of course, his own fortunes had taken a hit from the railway introduction. So in the evidence that comes out from the commission, we see this dual view of the infrastructures. On the one hand, the governmental statist impulse that Trollope embodies as a representative of the civil service, of the macro network needed to fulfill a strategic priority: communication, commerce, rule, centralized order from London. And yet this kind of rich narrative making and experience and practice of the infrastructures on the ground, the micro making of infrastructures which are charged by profit, ambition, interest, care, and local affections. Excuse me. So there's a sort of duality to the way in which it works. Okay. So where are we talking about? I've got the area that in question here. This is where Trollope himself had lived for some time in Clonmel, a former stagecoaching town and hub. And the place, Gould's Cross, was somewhere around here, connecting to the railway line, travelling there. What we can see here is a pre-railway map of the area, Taylor and Skinner's map of the roads of Ireland in 1778, and I've sort of put a red line around where I think Gould's Cross probably is. Excuse me. And I just draw your attention to Claire Connolly's really thought-provoking article on lanism in Anthony Trollope's Irish novels, where she talks about how the way Trollope encounters and writes about the older infrastructure of Irish lanes and boreens as means to inscribe, she says, the bumpy territory of Irish modernity in compelling ways. And I found that a very useful way to think about these moments of transition between the imperial centralized infrastructures of the rail and the postal system and these pre-existing networks and meshes of roads that we see here, and these dotted lines suggesting a road may not in fact be a road at all. So Gould's Cross starts to appear on the map only in the railway era. Here it is in the railway clearinghouse map, excuse me, from 1906. And you can see it's basically the junction and on the main line that still exists. If I had come to Cork in person, no doubt I might have travelled on this line down from Dublin and whizzed past it. And this spur line was a recent introduction in the early 20th century, and Clonmel was only really not on a direct line to Dublin at this time. So this was the way for the Dublin posts to make their way to Clonmel most efficiently, by being picked up at Gould's Cross and coming on a mail car down this road here. And it may not surprise you to know that if we look at where Gould's Cross is now, you can see that trains really don't stop here anymore. I think there's about 12 properties now in Gould's Cross, and you'll whiz past it on the train. So there's a sense of the place as one that is brought into existence by the railway as a junction, by the intersection of technologies, and then it disappears. And just to give us a sense of the kind of disproportionate sort of consumption of the state that comes to focus on this junction, you know, Gould's Cross is mentioned 105 times in the evidence, Cork itself at 400 times, given the relative scale of these places, that a small place can be a bump in a road that makes it visible. Excuse me. So it embodies to me the friction between the agency of the residual aspects of the network of the roads and the liberal freedoms of postal contractors to maximize scarce opportunities for profit from the British state. But it comes and goes within a 100-year period. So, scaling up, what scale of place can claim priority in infrastructure investment? Now, this is something that was very much a feature in the inquiry, and also something that is with us still today. And in the evidence, there's a wonderful kind of dueling between Trollope and the MP for Clonmel, where Trollope is grilled for evidence about exactly how much mail goes through Clonmel. And he says, it'll be easily seen if I'm expected to give this sort of evidence of Clonmel, I must be expected to do it of hundreds of towns situated in different counties to which this inquiry goes. Amounts I'd be expected to give would be very voluminous and more than should be reasonably looked for. The MP replies, there are 100 such towns in the district, or 50 towns the size of Clonmel. No, not the size of Clonmel. Is Clonmel not one of the first inland towns in Ireland? It's one of the first inland towns of Ireland, but you know, I can't give you evidence for all the towns of this scale. Another honourable member for a county other than Tipperary might think the towns of his county was deserving of importance with Clonmel. So Trollope here really is giving as good as he gets in this evidence and pushing back. And you know, he's pushed again by the MP. Are you aware? You know, surely Clonmel is the best. And Trollope's killer line is, I'm sorry to say, I should be sorry to say that it was not so. But although Clonmel is a good town, I think Kilkenny is as good. And there's this sort of line that Trollope delivers in the evidence, which basically is that macro view of an infrastructure, right? That thinking at the state governmental size, there's nothing specific about Clonmel in scale, in traffic and economic importance. It could be Kilkenny and or any other town. So that sense that the macro infrastructural view erases the specificity of a place and makes it infinitely substitutable when it comes to a provincial town. And so there's this strong sense here of the emergence of the provincial town as something that is endlessly replaceable. So, and to me, this aspect of the exchange in the evidence really brings me to some of the core thinking I've been doing about the provincial novel as a literary form and the idea of provincialism. So some of you may know a very well-known essay by Ian Duncan, the brilliant critic, who draws a distinction between the type of description and place writing that we associate with regional fiction and that which we might think of as provincial fiction. And here in this essay, the key distinction for Duncan is that regional fiction, regional novels, regional writing, whether that's Scott or Edgeworth or Bronte, is distinctive because it evokes a place and a landscape, a set of speech patterns, of dialect, of behaviours that are in and of themselves distinct. So Bronte's Yorkshireman, Edgeworth's Edgeworth's characters in the Irish novels, that sense that it could only be in that place. And that contrast Duncan suggests with what he terms the provincial fiction of Eliot and Trollope in particular, where the provincial county town or parish in a sense could be endlessly substitutable to some extent. That we've got the long quote from on region and province there from Duncan. But to summarize, there's a sense that the provincial town can be anywhere versus the distinctive linguistic or topographical specificity of the regional novel. A region dramatizes the uneven developments suppressed in national discourse. And for Duncan, the provincial absorbs and stands in for the nation as a substitutable any place, not London. Duncan argues that the provincial town is the authentic site of an imperial England, able to select and absorb the forces of change, renewing rather than surrendering its traditional properties. And provincial, Duncan suggests, as opposed to regional aesthetics, are those of conservative stasis. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of an issue with Duncan here in slightly different lines than I've done before, because in Trollope's hands, I don't think the province and the provincial town is about conservative stasis, but crucially, it is about sequence, flow, and replaceability in the infrastructures of the modern state. So, part 2, the road to Barchester travels through Waterford, Tipperary, Cork, and Limerick, and not just in biographical terms, but as encounters with a collision of the infrastructures of the local and national and imperial. So provincialism as a term is something born imperial. It comes out of a long Roman history of the governance of a distant space, and its identity is stripped and made dependent on that imperial centre. So there may be those reasons why we can think of, politically complex though it is, that Trollope thinks of his management and his civil service role in Ireland as one in relation to provincialism as opposed to nationalism. The provincial town is a space in these fictions that we might be familiar with, whether that's Cranford, Scenes of Clerical Life, Middlemarch, as a space of collision between older infrastructures and new imperial state networks. And provincial identity depends on a place within a transport communication infrastructure. And this is quite different, I would say, from regional fictions in the vein of Scott or Edgeworth, where the region is imagined as distinct in and of itself. You kind of drop off the transport system into Scott's Scotland or Edgeworth's Ireland, or indeed Bronte's Yorkshire. There's a breakdown that lands you there, whereas somewhere like Middlemarch, the trains and the mail coaches are running all the time, and that's part of the experience of infrastructural change that those places go through. But in a networked state, I'm going to suggest, in a networked imagining, the small town is replaceable, as are its individuals. They come to stand in for the functioning of a type. And so I would say that in this genre of provincial fiction, I think is important because it does a lot to erase some of the strong affects of nationalism through an emphasis on local politics. But what fascinates me when we come to Barchester is that the Barchester sequence focuses on the politics and rivalries of Cathedral and Church of England dioceses, not on some big questions of the state and politics like the later Palliser series. So how might we understand this as following from Trollope's infrastructural understandings of the workings of locality? And I've just listed the Barchester sequence of novels here below. So I'm not going to go into too much detail for this today, but the framework that I'm thinking of here is that by turning his attention to the politics and the local politics of an English cathedral's town, city, in fact, Trollope brought into focus some of the major political shifts in local government infrastructures during the 19th century. What I've got on your right there is a quotation from the Webb's monumental history of English local government, and they really characterize the passing of the New Poor Law in 1844 as what they term as the death of the parish as a unit of local government. What you might remember is prior to the 1834 Poor Law, the management of poor relief and poor rates were raised through church vestries, which are obviously a temporal civic kind of dimension to the spatial governance of the Church of England parish system. With the New Poor Law, there's a development of elected boards of guardians, of unitary authorities elected to come together on a larger scale to provide for workhouses under the New Poor Law. It's an uneven picture of development. In some places took decades to bring in the New Poor Law, for example, Coventry. But in the end, as the Webb suggests, it lays an axe to the root of that most important trunk of the parish structure. There is, in a sense, no direct or para local governmental control role for the parish post 1834. And at the same time, this runs in parallel with huge amounts of reform to the temporal role of the Church of England. The Ecclesiastical Commissioners Acts of 1836 and 1840 led to a massive restructuring of pay, income, posts, infrastructures of the bishoprics and dioceses of England, and a massive centralisation of church assets. So in the English state, of course, the established church is in partnership with the state. But what we see in this focus in the mid-19th century is an increasing secularization of that state and a vastly diminished role for the church within the infrastructures of that state. But they're left with these legacies. So just to give us an example of how that might have played out on the ground, I've got some maps here of Winchester. Here's from 1870. Now, Winchester is one of the couple of models that Trollope clearly had in mind when he was thinking about Barchester. He went to school in Winchester, and the story of Hiram's Hospital that underpins the narrative of the Warden and many of the Barchester sequence is based on the scandal around St. Cross Hospital, an ancient endowed almshouse, which is just down here on the map. But what I've ringed here are the two visible structures on this map. One is the cathedral and the quarters around it. And here next to the railway line to the north is the new workhouse constructed in 1836-87. So you can see the scale of these infrastructures. There are only two buildings, in a sense, that are visible in this scale in Winchester. And we have the ancient cathedral and we have the new workhouse that kind of operate at that scale. And if we zoom in Winchester in this period, you can see that the detail of that Union workhouse built on the Y plan outlined by the Poor Law Commissioners, and how it's sort of spawned, if you like, almost a district, a state infrastructural district. We've got the state-funded parochial schools, the waterworks, the burial ground, up here the gas works, and what you can't see off left here is actually the police, regional police headquarters and the infantry barracks. So there's a kind of sense of a state infrastructural set of developments happening to this quarter of Winchester, leaving the ancient cathedral structures to one side. Now, in the initial volume of the Barchester sequence, The Warden, it's clear that Trollope is responding very directly to some press exposures of the financial management of an old, ancient, endowed charity and almshouse, St. Cross Hospital in Winchester. Here's a picture of what it looks like now, down on the River Itchen. You know, it couldn't be more different to the Y-shaped plan and scale of the workhouse housing 300 inhabitants under the state provisions for the poor in the north of Winchester. Here, St. Cross Hospital sustained 13 old men, and the fund was supposed to also pay for 100 poor men to also receive some sustenance. And here we've got a kind of swinging attack on the management of the charity and the huge payments it gave to the master of the institution, British aristocrat, £4,000 a year, nominated by the Bishop of Winchester, none of which went for the care of the poor. So there's a huge kind of public furore around this in 1853 when church charities are being probed into about what the ancient charity should do and how the poor should be cared for in the modern state. The present age is not behind its predecessors in munificent charity, but it adopts another form. People do not fund almshouses now by deeds of gift to any great extent. Committees and guinea subscriptions are the order of the day. We have a new way of looking after the poor. And here we have the poor loving Septimus Harding, who had been the warden of the almshouse, Hiram's Hospital in the Warden and in Barchester Towers. He's trying to get his job back. And he's condemned by the new man Slope, the new evangelical cleric Slope, and basically told this is Harding quoting Slope's words in the next chapter and their effect on him. New men are carrying out new measures and are carting away the useless rubbish of past centuries. What cruel words these have been and how often they're now used with all the heartless cruelty of a Slope. A man is sufficiently condemned if it can only be shown that either in politics or religion, he does not belong to some new school established within the last score of years. He may then regard himself as rubbish and expected to be carted away. And indeed, you know, Harding comes to understand his place in this new and more secular infrastructural state as being no more than rubbish. His self cannot be sustained in opposition to these new reformist structures of the state and its allocations of welfare. So what I'm suggesting that we see in the Barchester sequence is Trollope and kind of encountering this sense of the church under pressure and the purpose of the church, but particularly the temporal and secular role of the church. What is the church for? How should it sustain a common good beyond the kind of the political infightings and religious infightings of its inhabitants? And this comes up again and again in the sequence. And I would suggest that what we see most evidently is the question of the functioning of the church as a kind of civic infrastructure, a decentralized space in which conversations and care can happen. And there's many moments across the sequence where that's really clear. And this is brought to my mind really because there's a very current debate in the Church of England at the moment, which just caught my eye in the press, about how the Church of England is now clogged by its historic infrastructures, i.e. churches and the parish systems, and an evangelical current towards what's called fresh expressions, where you just get a community of worshippers together in a supermarket, you meet online. Why do we need the infrastructures of the church anymore? What is a parish? And this is very interesting to me, that this is, in terms of the geographies of local neighborhood communication and community, the spaces served by churches, provided by churches as church halls, even for secular purposes, are really crucial in fostering, you know, neighborhood associations still. So what is the if you like, the secular infrastructural function of these architectural legacies of the 19th century churches that we're still living with in many British towns in particular? Okay, so I'm here going to give a big nod to Susan, who I can see on my screen here, because this also kind of relates to a conversation Susan and I started about 8 years ago about Trollope and the post office. And she's got a great article on affect and logistics in Trollope's post office that I've learned a lot from here as well. So we can see across the Barchester sequence then how there is a shifting in centres of power from the old diocese, namely Barchester in this case, to London and Westminster and Fleet Street. The new bishop, Bishop Proudie, really wants to be in Westminster hobnobbing with the other bishops in the House of Lords, not in Barchester. He wants to minimise the time he spends in this local political context. The scandal and the outcomes of what's happening at Hiram's Hospital is not judged by the local community, but by the interventions of Tom Towers, editor of the Jupiter newspaper in London. And as Susan's work has shown, there's this disjunction between the localized affect and the logistics of the centralized post office and the way it works through the small house in Allington in particular. And in the last chronicle of Barset, there's that continual question as to where does a very poor curate and an archdeacon stand in the nested infrastructures of the modern state. There's the abject poverty of Josiah Crawley and the temporal ambitions of Archdeacon Grantley, who wants to have power over a territory, a local landed estate in Barchester that he sees entirely in keeping with his religious role, but the text is often questioning his very materialistic desires to be a landowner and a country squire as well as a parson. And this idea of what's termed the squarson, historians term it, has been a very long-standing notion of the temporal and religious joint role of country parsons in England for hundreds of years. And of course, there's that general question in the sequence: who cares for the poor of the parish? Who benefits? And how should the care of the poor have changed in modernity? And how far should the church reflect the rationalizations of the modern state? So throughout the Barchester sequence, there's this tension between civic, national interests and networks, the law courts, Westminster, the Jupiter newspaper, and diocesan patronage, traditionals and temporal authority, and the parochial local affections that attach you to a place. Part 3, my final part. And here I want us to really delve a little more into form in a bit more detail. So across this larger project on provincialism, I've been really struck by how so much provincial fiction seems to be writing back to the form of the European Bildungsroman and its role in romantic ideas of nation formation across the long 19th century. And here I've got a really thought-provoking quote from Jed Estin, his great book on the kind of the afterlife of the Bildungsroman, Unseasonable Youth. And he suggests that the Bildungsroman matches this early national cultural system in Europe, that the Bildungsroman could mediate between unevenly developed regions and so on and so forth. It could almost naturalize what nations did to contain and naturalize the problems of uneven development by appeal to a common culture, language and destiny. Their organicist claims underlie a reciprocal allegory within the representative soul, i.e. the protagonist of the Bildungsroman. But what Esty suggests is that these claims of the romantic Bildungsroman somehow capture a national soul is unsustainable with what he calls the inorganic entities of the modern state. And so I guess my contention is that Trollope's serial provincial fiction is a form that can contain and attach us, that aspires to attach us and contain us within the inorganic flows of the modern infrastructure state, and that its literary form, as opposed to the holistic focus on the individual representative soul as protagonist in the Bildungsroman, is doing something very different that's much more like the nodes on that networked system that I was showing us earlier in Trollope's encounter with the Irish postal networks. So if we think about provincial fiction as a kind of anti-Bildungsroman form, or a form that works against the Bildungsroman in an age of transition, I would suggest that we do see uneven development in the Bildungsroman, but we focus on the pain of transition, the impact of collision when new structures are put in place. So often provincial fictions are the stories of those who don't get to leave home. They are the stories of, for example, I always come back to the example of Lydgate in Middlemarch, who has this great journey across Europe, but gets a bit stuck in Middlemarch, and Middlemarch has the better of him. Also often the stories of those who are left behind and cannot take their great soul on a Wilhelm Meister type journey across the nation. And of course, provincial fiction is brilliant at showing how the local is part of an imperial system, whether that's Cranford's connectivity with India, or I just gestured towards Joe McDonough's great work on the village and Henry Main's analysis of India in that citation there. And we can see that peak of provincial fiction really spans those few decades in which the reforms of the 1830s were starting to bite as lived experience across the nation and beyond. So what is it about Trollope's provincial fiction that can place us in this relationship to the modern infrastructure state? So some of it is about seriality and replaceability. And I owe a kind of great thanks here to Maya McAlevey, who's written brilliantly about Trollope and as well as Young and kind of large scale serial form text in a context I found really creative for me. McAlevey writes, through the narrative form of the series, the Barsetshire and Palliser novels celebrate what Trollope identifies as the central virtues of institutionality. And I suppose I would suggest, with a slight tweak, we think about infrastructure in these terms, replaceability and adaptability. Replaceability is a function of times. As years pass over the long sequence of time taken by these novels returning to the same characters, characters age and institutional roles are filled and refilled. We might think of how the Reverend Slope is replaced in a sense by Mr. Thumble in later volumes of the Barchester sequence. As clergymen and politicians are promoted up the ladders of the church and government, others emerge to take their place. So in Barchester's serial novel, it's really important, I think, we care for the beleaguered lovers, the number of them. We care for the frustrated middle-aged man, whether that's Archdeacon Grantley or Josiah Crawley. We know them intimately. This caring matters, and it's part of a humanized infrastructure that we see. But we're also told very firmly to accept their systematic replaceability within the sequence and to love their successor too. We must love Lily Dale just as much as we love, for example, Eleanor Bold, maybe a little bit more. We must see infrastructures, and Trollope's narrator is constantly telling us we must come to see and understand infrastructures at the macro level. But we must also, Trollope's writing and characterization shows us and tells us we must feel and experience infrastructures at the micro level with the characters as they move. So Trollope's fiction gives this extraordinary kind of toggling between the macro and the micro as a reading experience. So here, just an example of some of Trollope's quite famous kind of interventions as narrator. Here we have Trollope stepping up to say, don't worry, Eleanor will not marry Mr. Slope. It's an extraordinary kind of breaking of the remaking of the narrator's pact. This is only chapter 15 of Barchester Tales, and he's just set up the fact that all the inhabitants of Barchester think that Eleanor Slope might marry two very undesirable men. He ventures to reprobate that system, which goes so far to violate all promise of confidence from these authors and his readers by maintaining nearly to the end of the third volume a mystery as to the fate of their first favourite personage. Nay, he doesn't want to give false hope and expectations, he's saying. Is this not a species of deceit to which the honesty of the present age should lend no countenance? He's saying we storytellers should be transparent with our readers as to what our structure is. This novel is going to have the right kind of happy ending. I'm going to have to look at my own notes for this because I can't read this quote because it's covered up. So our doctrine, he says, in this kind of macro scale perspective on the narratorial pact, our doctrine is that author and reader should move along together in full confidence with each other. I would not for the value of this chapter have it believed by a single reader that my Eleanor could bring herself to marry Mr. Slope, or that should be sacrificed to Bertie Stanhope. But among the good folk of Barchester, many believed one and the other. So again, that sense that we as readers are told there is a macro scale structure to this novel, and I've told you what it is, and you can flow through it freely. But at the micro scale, the beliefs of the parochial inhabitants are much more bumpy, much smaller scale, and they believe that they can act and change this structure. So there's this funny disjunction between the lived experience in which the agents and characters believe they can reshape the structures within which they live, but we as readers, as implied readers, are told, no, we're traveling through this much more kind of planned out structure of the text. And again, this is in Dr. Thorne, for example, where the reader is granted the freedom to choose who we want to see as our hero. Francis Gresham would have been the hero of our tale had that place not been preoccupied by the village doctor. As it is, those who please may so regard him. Those who don't approve of a middle-aged bachelor country doctor as hero may take the heir to Greshambury in his stead and call the book, if it so pleases them, The Loves and Adventures of Francis Newbold Gresham the Younger. So to me, there's something going on here about Trollope's state of liberal freedom. I won't go into my kind of encounters with other people who talk about Trollope's liberalism here, but slightly different sense of that. But there is a strong sense, isn't there, of free choice for subjects who know the game and can flow through its infrastructures. And in some ways, to me, this felt a real echo of what Patrick Joyce writes about the work of the post office. Here, Joyce suggests the general post office enabled the disparate aspects of a free society to know and evaluate one another, thus aiming to make the economy and society self-regulating, as they should be and essentially were according to the fantasies of liberal governance. And there's this kind of same kind of fantasy of liberal governance here, the fantasy of the implied reader who can choose who they want to be the hero because they know the structures of this text so well. But to me, it's that duality in Trollope's work that he's also giving us the micro scale at such a compelling level of characterization that that we feel that kind of both and here. So he can show us the infrastructure and make us, in a sense, kind of the correct kind of liberal subject to understand the rules of that apparent freedom of flowing through an infrastructure as readers, at the same time as not occluding the experiential level of living through that kind of transition of the modern infrastructure state. And to me, again, I wanted to come back finally to Paul Edwards' piece on infrastructure and modernity. In this, quite formative piece, he's talking about all the classic things like ARPANET and the histories of large-scale technology, and it's a really great review piece where he's talking about the strengths and weaknesses of analysing the histories of infrastructure at the macro scale in terms of structure and form, and at the micro level, the social constructive analysis, where you look at how individuals can shape and alter infrastructures. And it is that sense to me here of Trollope is super aware, and we see that in the Select Committee inquiry papers, as we see it in his fiction, on, in a sense, the way in which technological forms change over time, but they address the same sorts of questions. They address functions, so post, telegraph, telephone, email, all trying to fulfill the clarity of issues around producing and communicating in a market society and communicating distant rule. And yet, if I find my final page, at the micro scale, these forms shift constantly, and particular technologies and systems are very much in view. So what we see in Trollope's novel then is someone like Archdeacon Grantley, I would say, is the chief of Trollope's micro-scale social constructivists who really believe they can shape the structure themselves, and that they do shape it in their everyday actions. And yet in that duality of the macro scale, Trollope's modernity is, to me, embodied in that sense of the flows and shapes of infrastructure, in which we are all, in a sense, a bit like Gould's cross. We are all nodes on a network that spring into being and into attention for a fixed period of time because of the role we fulfill. But in that, in the kind of modern techno state, when we cease to fulfill that function, our form can be replaced by someone or something that replicates that, whether that's the hero, whether that's the frustrated middle-aged cleric, whether that's the aspirant politician. Someone else can take our place. And it's that strange combination of the sense of survival and loss that to me embodies the affects that surround reading Trollope serially. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Well, that was fantastic, Ruth. Thank you so much. That's given me so much to think about, and pages of notes, I have to say. I don't quite know where to start myself, and I can see that Patricia has already left a question for you in the chat. So Patricia, if you don't mind, perhaps you could come on screen and elaborate on it yourself.
Yes, just a moment here. Good morning. So nice to be back with you all today after a real roller coaster ride of a day for me yesterday. I must apologize, but Ruth, lovely to see you again and to hear your paper. And I speak, I think, more articulately than I type. So my question had to do, really my comment had to do with the way your vocabulary helped me to frame and think more deeply about infrastructures within Maria Graham's travel writings, particularly this notion of the nodes and the macro and the micro. In my comment, I was thinking that there is this whole governmentally driven sense of the macro that she sees unfolding in Chile even before the railways are possible. But that as she tries to navigate Chile at much more of the micro level and uncover the history and the folklore, the customs of the people, the traditions, she's really looking at roads, infrastructures that are literally invisible, but she is directed towards them by the people of Chile who remember these pathways and roads. And there's a real chance that imaginary network will disappear when those people pass on, or when the governmental roads will, eclipse any of those memories. And so I was just wondering how memory fits into that as you think about Trollope, and these contrasts that.
It's really interesting because to me, Trollope's a very, very unnostalgic writer, actually, just off the top of my head. But what you're saying does make me think a lot about William Cobbett, actually, who in his Rural Rides is explicitly trying to rediscover and ride down roads that are the non-governmental ones. And that people everywhere are saying, I think there was a road there. And it's this extraordinary thing about, is a road there, or is a road not there? And what counts as a road? What counts as a right of way? But I suppose, it's not my field at all, but I suppose, I think in Indigenous studies would be the place I would go to kind of really theorize the ideas of mobility and memory and movement that might be behind Graham's encounters in terms of landscape and yeah, I think that might be a way to really think in the way that I'm thinking one of my PhD students, for example, who's worked quite extensively with third generation Indigenous communities to this is in relation to Stevenson's Pacific, actually. This is my student Chloe, who use that in a really interesting way to think through what Stevenson does with an object in his book. And I think that that kind of honouring of Indigenous encounters when we can do it, and really thinking, what did these roads mean? What do they mean now within the cultures of the communities that Graham was encountering, will be a fascinating thing to look at. Because a road isn't just a piece of infrastructure, it is a cultural creation, isn't it? I suppose that's what we're getting at here.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much, Patricia. I can see that Susan's just left a very interesting question in the chat. Susan, would you mind coming on screen to ask it?
Sure, thank you. And thanks, Ruth, for, you always give brilliant talks, and so this is an expected delight. So I guess my question is just, you could just take it as a general question about critical infrastructure studies and where it's headed since we began our conversation about that 8 years ago. There's all this incredible work that's just exploding the public works model. And, so to me, like, my aha moment listening to your talk was your division between seeing it at the macro level or feeling it at the micro level. And so I guess I'm sort of asking, like, does that map onto this divergence in critical infrastructural studies? Or if not, like, what is its relationship to, for example, the visibility thesis is another way that people have split open the topic. So like Paul Edwards says, and other people, Susan Starr is we only see it when it fails. And, then of course the more liberatory sorts of narratives where it's like, no, we see it all the time. Like, you just haven't looked, right? It's failing all the time, all the rest. So it's, I'll just let you, sort of situate your work, your talk in relation to that work.
Yeah, all I can say is, thank you for the reading list. No, I don't mean that, but this is really great, and I think that's right. I think unconsciously, there is that. There's definitely that, and that seeing, feeling split is really useful. Actually, I think that is what I'm trying to get at. So thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, I haven't been to be honest, I haven't been reading much around infrastructure since I finished the last book. I've been kind of deep in the provinces. So this has been a really welcome time, but I haven't kind of encountered the huge body of work that has happened in critical infrastructure studies since. So I will go away and think more about that. Off the top of my head, yeah, it's hard, isn't it? I think, like with any of these terms, once it becomes too generalized, does it stop being useful? I like the idea of civic infrastructure, but I want to know where the stuff is. I think infrastructure does need some stuff, and you can't really talk about, human relationships are not infrastructural in and of themselves. And I think to write that, I suppose for me, it's always thinking about the remove, where does the money come from when it comes down to it? Thinking particularly about the American examples, that once people start talking about infrastructure, something that doesn't require massive investment and sustained work to keep it going, and political will, then we're kind of going to quite a dangerous place. So that's my only reservation about the affect kind of dimension to it, really. But thank you so much. I shall go and read, and then we should get together and just talk about stuff, Susan. That would be great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. Caroline, I can see that you've got a question about readerly discomfort in Trollope and Eliot. Would you like to come on screen and say it?
Yeah, thank you. I thought that was a great paper, and I'm not sure this is a very formulated question, but I'm thinking, just linking it with Nicola's paper earlier and the discussion of Daniel Deronda and readers wanting a different ending, and certainly when I've taught Daniel Deronda, I've had students who have said, actually, I'm really frustrated he didn't marry Gwendolen. So the elements of surprise in that novelistic structure and the withholding of certain readerly expectations built into that novel, versus Trollope's kind of really interesting strategies there around, the idea of full confidence with the reader, but not giving surprise at all, and actually saying this is going to happen. So actually the narrative revelations are not really what you're looking for here. So I mean, it really is a question around kind of ideas of misreading, and maybe kind of linking that a little bit more broadly to your discussions of structure and the committees, when Trollope is saying to various MPs, you're actually misreading this, you're misreading the landscape, you're giving a reading of Ireland, you don't even understand the topography of how this links to this. I mean, is there something around different kinds of structures with these writers in terms of what they're doing with the novelistic structure and notions of withholding comfort with the reader or flagging things up in certain ways? I mean, in a way, the Trollope strategy reminds me more of Thackeray than of Eliot, the kind of idea of you would like, I could give you this character, but actually that would be very boring, so I'm not going to do that. It seems to link a lot more closely to those metafictional strategies than to the Eliot surprise part. So it's a really, it's a question about novelistic infrastructures and, the degree to which the reader is supposed to be comfortable or uncomfortable during the process of reading.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it is the idea. It is the illusion of freedom, I think, in Trollope's works that seems quite distinctive to me. And so that's the one thing that it's not quite choose your own adventure, but there is that sort of sense in Trollope's work that take it as you want, in that sense that the kind of the looseness that we're kind of retold the story so often, even in the same novel with the same characters. We said, as you may remember it, this has happened, and that's, I agree. I mean, they're all kind of riffing off Fielding to some extent. We could go back to Fielding and the on his novel as a kind of stagecoach journey. But I won't kind of go back there. The difference, I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and Nicola and I were laughing about the irony that I'm supposed to be working on a project on Eliot and I'm talking on Trollope. She's written lots about Trollope and is talking about Eliot. It's been such a lovely holiday from Eliot in a way, and to me the difference is actually more about how he does character. So it's not just about the surprise element. It's about the access we're given to character. And the access and the consistency of characters within themselves in that way, and that's in a sense why, I mean, obviously Deronda's complex because of the disjunction and the narrative temporalities that Nicola was drawing our attention to. There's a very deliberate attempt there to kind of mislead. But I think in Trollope's work, characters are so strongly visualized. We're back to the seeing, feeling thing. So strongly visualized as moving, and my colleague Sophie Gilmartin's written brilliantly about how he uses almost theatrical techniques of blocking to move characters around. So you always know exactly where Archdeacon Grantley is standing in relation to his wife in her dressing room when they're having an argument, or where they are in relation to the furniture, in relation to the dress they're wearing, in relation to the sofa they're standing next to. And to me, that was one of the key differences of thinking about how Eliot does character, that they're not body minds in the same way that you get in Eliot's work. So we see them, we externally characterize, I suppose, in a way that's something that's neither Dickens is all surface nor Eliot's all depth, and there's something that's about movement and embodiment that's there in Trollope's work. So that's one of the things that I was trying to get at in terms of that disjunction, that in a way we are given access to minds in Eliot's work in ways that really ask us to be with their mind. We don't get that in Trollope. So I think Eliot's work, despite the kind of the big narrator voice, which you will think we remember, is doing a lot more free and direct discourse and sliding us into a character in ways it's very uncomfortable to come out of again. We don't really get that in Trollope, I don't think. I mean, little snapshots where we sit in the Archdeacon's boots, but we're told you're going to sit in the Archdeacon's boots and it's going to feel a bit uncomfortable, you know. So yeah, that's one of the key differences, I would say, in terms of narrative form. Surprise, yeah, I think a lot of it is about Eliot's organicism, that she wants us to experience the novel organically, whereas I suppose maybe it's that Trollope wants us to see it systemically, if that makes sense. I need to think more about that, but thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruth and Caroline, for the question. Nicola, you're up next, actually.
If there's nobody else who's going to hop in, because I can definitely monopolise at another point, but I'm probably more coherent actually in writing than in speech at this point in the day. But yeah, I really like that the idea of kind of structural transparency, and I was wondering about the kind of different configurations around centres of power, particularly local power, in all of Trollope's works that I've read, which is a fraction of them. And yeah, I just wondered about the shifting ethical stakes between the parish and the borough, and how sort of structural transparency, not just for us as readers, but also for the characters kind of operating within those power structures. I just wondered about the shifting ethical stakes of that in Trollope's view.
So you're thinking about the palaces there as opposed to Barchester, or the kind of the scale of the borough as opposed to the scale of which novels did you have in mind in particular you're thinking of, Nicola?
I guess I was thinking about comparison between Barchester and the palaces, but also, you know, even putting aside the palaces because they don't exist at this point in time, just thinking about kind of electoral reform and that kind of cast back to what do we do with these boroughs and who knows how they run anyway. Good
question. I mean, I suppose my instinct when it comes to the palaces sequence, and I think why they're still so popular with MPs, is that actually Westminster politics becomes a parochial village in those stories, and it's exactly the same individual desire for supremacy, and you know, it becomes a matter of, you know, kind of localized rivalries and ambitions. And in fact, the national mission of the national government seems to play so little role. And it's a while since I've read the palaces, but no one's really thinking about it. It's a bit Johnsonian government, isn't it, really? It's all about, you know, who you're going to stab in the back and get to power now. No, I'm a bit going wrong there, two very different local configurations of local power. Yeah, except I suppose that in some ways what you see in Trollope's work is the enmeshment of the establishment, right? That as I say, Grantley wants to be the squire and the parson, and is the squire and the parson in a model that was completely possible in those days. Similarly, Mark, can't remember his name, Robarts, you know, wants to be the kind of the racing man of leisure, and you know, is rarely in his vicarage. He wants to be one of the landed aristocracy, really. So there's that whole kind of way in which power is held at this very small scale in both sequences, I think. The thing that troubles me about Trollope, and I didn't get in here, and it's so striking coming to Trollope after spending time with Eliot, is the line which he draws between those whose lives just simply aren't of interest or are non-narratable. That there is, so, you know, the inhabitants of Hiram's Hospital, okay, just about two of them speak in a kind of comedy way. There is no one of a you know, below middle class level ever in a Trollope novel, and like a middle class, upper middle class level. That's, I'm not going to do anything about that in this paper, obviously, but it's that sense as if power has no interest or responsibility, and you know, so that is a question of state formation is really, you know, is really kind of toxic about the liberal state, that the liberal state doesn't include loads of people, the majority of the population. It's just this thing that these group of people who think they are the world. It's not really an answer, sorry, Nicola, but we can talk more about that.
I actually have a question that piggybacks off Nicola, so thanks very much, Nicola, for that question. in the sense of like the dispersal of or even, I mean, sorry, let me start again. I'm not like Nicola, I'm not too coherent at this point of the day. You spoke about the diminished role of the church within this increasingly secularized state. And it got me wondering about how other religiously motivated individuals who are connected with state actors end up playing quite a large role in providing services that the state isn't providing. So like the huge role that philanthropists play in the 19th century with providing quite large almost infrastructural contributions to state life, even though they're only kind of tangentially attached to the state and also tangentially attached to the church. I suppose I just wondered whether you could kind of comment more on where you see people and groups like them sitting within your vision of this infrastructural kind of micro macro.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, it kind of taps into one of my sort of reservations about Joe Goldie's work, for example, on Roads of Power, which I think is really provocative and useful kind of conversation piece, really. But I mean, her argument is that infrastructure declines in the 19th century after a kind of major period of state investment. But, you know, my contention is the majority, much as I might like to think about the 19th century road expansion as being a state-led centralized project, it really was beyond the kind of the legal facilitation of it through Parliament. It was about local landowners, justice of the peace, raising and making money through turnpike trusts, deciding they could privatize public space to make money that would provide some kind of service to the speeding up of the mails. And also it was those mail contractors who then took up the contracts. You know, the railway network was not a state network, of course. You know, it was all a load of kind of competing private contractors. And of course, it still is through the majority of its history. The mail contract that Trollope's discussing was held by B&Coney, somebody made a fortune out of government contracts. So there's this, you know, the 19th century as now, let's not even start talking about the military, you know, makes people make a huge amount of money out of government contracts. And do we see those as centralized projects, or do we see those as things that the state facilitates? It's an interesting question as to what is a state property, an infrastructure state. Does it have to be owned by the state, or is it just facilitated and actually it's enriching and sustaining private enterprise? The large, I mean, I suppose what I would say in my story of the 19th century and philanthropy in particular would be the functioning of charitable bodies as an increasingly professionalized in an increasingly professionalized way, using the language of kind of emergent social science. I'm thinking of the Charity Organisation Society or Octavia Hill's rent collecting organisations. Those were key when it came to the Paulo Commission in 1905, that the Webbs and everyone was on. The work that, in a sense, they made the space in which the state could then sit. They showed that it was possible to have these kinds of tests around welfare, to provide something that looked very like social work, that looked very like what we'd now think of social housing, even though it was done through a charitable means. So that's the sort of history there, I would say, that it's about the welfare state coming into being through these notions of philanthropy interacting with emergent social science. And the Hill family obviously being a huge part in that as well as kind of other wealthy philanthropists. And obviously the history of the late 20th century to now is a strange reversal of that kind of process.
Interesting, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? We've got a few more minutes before we'll need to wrap up for the day. So if anyone's got any last burning questions for Ruth at all. Speak now or forever hold your peace.
I'm only sorry that Claire can't be with us today, because it turns out she lives in Clonmel. I just had a quick chat with her yesterday, and I was saying, oh, I've ended up just getting obsessed with this little place, and you know, but not Clonmel's little, but Gould's Cross, and yeah, but maybe she might have a chance to encounter it later on. So it'd be great to hear what she had to think about that, I think.
I haven't visited yet myself, actually, so it's on my bucket list now.
But you must have been through it on a train. You've been through. You got the train from Dublin to Cork.
Yes, so I must have been through it.
You must have been through it. I want you to have your Google Maps on next time, so you can know that's where the man fell off the cart and lost the mailbags.
Yeah, exactly. I might. call our discussion to a close here and just say again, thank you so much to Ruth, of course, for a fascinating keynote paper, to Nicola earlier for our first keynote of the day today, and to all the brilliant speakers throughout the day and yesterday as well. I've personally learned so much from hearing you all talk over the last couple of days, and it's really helped to develop my thinking around infrastructure and communities in a huge way. So thank you very much, and I hope you've likewise got a lot from this event as well.